It's August 1989 in the northern city of Prince George, British Columbia. A man has been struggling to find steady work and is approached by a complete stranger with what sounds like the perfect opportunity. The job promises strong pay. There's even talk of daycare for his children and work for his wife. On paper, it's everything the family needs to turn things around, to have a better life. So they leave that same night. The family climbs into a vehicle and heads west toward Highway 16, a stretch of road that would later become known as the Highway of Tears. More than 3 decades later, that family is still missing. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Darkly Speaking. I'm your host, Alex Kern, and tonight, I want to tell you the story of the Jack family, Ronnie Jack, his wife Doreen, and their 2 young sons. In the early morning hours of a summer day in 1989, they drive away with a bearded stranger who offered Ronnie work at a logging camp. What seems like the opportunity that could change their lives instead becomes something far darker, because they are never seen again. What follows isn't just a disappearance, but a case marked by missteps, delays, and unanswered questions, and one that unfolded along a road already known for too many of the same kinds of losses. It was a late summer evening on August 1st, 1989 in Prince George, British Columbia. This was, by all accounts, the kind of night that feels ordinary. Quiet streets, scattered porch lights, the slow rhythm of a small northern city settling into nightfall. That night, Ronnie Jack was at the First Leader pub, located at 1724 Strathcona Avenue. The bar sat less than a quarter mile from the Jack family home, and luckily, it was close enough to walk considering they didn't have a car at the time. Inside the pub, Ronnie ordered a drink, as he often did, and it wasn't long before another man stepped up beside him and the two struck up a conversation at the bar. The stranger stands out without really trying to. He's a large man in his mid to late 30s, somewhere between 6 and 6.5 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and solidly built. He's wearing a hat pulled low, a red checkered shirt, faded blue jeans, a blue nylon jacket, and work boots. He looks like a lumber worker, a man who looks like he belongs to the surrounding forests and logging roads. As the conversation continues, the man offers Ronnie a job at a logging camp out west, about 5 miles past Benesty near Cluckol's Lake. He explains that Ronnie would be bucking logs and Doreen, his wife, could help the camp cook in the kitchen. It sounds legitimate. Steady work, a short-term opportunity that starts right away, exactly what he's been hoping for. Ronnie listens carefully, weighing this opportunity in real time. He needs the work, and this offer arrives at a moment when saying yes not only feels reasonable, but completely necessary. So he wastes no time and begins making arrangements for his family. Before leaving, Ronnie makes a series of phone calls. He calls his brother in Burns Lake and asks if he can watch his sons, Russell and Ryan, for the next 2 weeks while him and Doreen are away. His brother can't take the boys, and with no one else available to care for them, Ronnie thinks back to what the stranger had mentioned earlier, that there's a daycare at the logging camp, which would allow him to bring his sons along. Next, Ronnie calls his mother, Mabel. He tells her he's found a job and will be working anywhere between 8 days to 2 weeks between Vanderhoof and Cluckol's Lake. He sounds excited, like this could finally be the break they've been waiting for, a chance to turn things around. And then, at the very end of the call, his tone shifts, and he adds something that makes the hair on the back of Mabel's neck stand up. Ronnie says, "Mom, if I don't come back, come and look for me at the house." Mabel has no way of knowing it, but she is the last known person to speak to the family. Ronnie's youngest sister, Lauren Jack, also lives in Prince George. That night, she sees Doreen running in and out of the house, preparing to leave. Around 1:30 a.m., Lauren watches the entire family climb into a white pickup truck that doesn't belong to the Jack family and drive away. As she stands there, Lauren feels uneasy. Something tells her to stay back, not to approach, not to intervene, and she listens to that instinct. And then there is nothing left but complete and utter silence. It's 1989 in rural Canada. Once someone leaves for a remote logging camp, there's no easy way to reach them. The family is expected to be gone for up to 2 weeks, so at first, not hearing from Ronnie or Doreen isn't necessarily unusual. Days stretch into weeks, and nearly a month passes without contact from anyone in the Jack family. Ronnie's parents begin to worry, so his father then reports him missing on August 25th. But by August 30th, the RCMP notes that they could have taken an additional week of work. In other words, the RCMP fully believes that Ronnie had simply found more employment and hadn't called home. Right now, all anyone knows is that a family has left for a job and hasn't come back. A job lead, a white pickup, a timeline that starts to feel off. But before the logging camp and before the silence, there's a longer story here, one that starts with Ronnie and Doreen. Understanding Ronnie and Doreen's relationship means sitting with two very different versions of the same story. From Mabel Jack's perspective, their relationship is totally normal. She speaks of Doreen as kind and helpful, someone she loved and appreciated. In her memory, there are no real difficulties between them. She recalls Doreen moving in at 16 because she didn't want to stay in the house where her father had died. Doreen's sister Marlene, however, remembers it differently. In her account, Doreen is not living with Ronnie when they first begin dating. Their father is very much still alive then, and he doesn't pass away from cancer until 1982. So already the timelines don't align. That gap may come from memory, perspective, or the way time reshapes events, but either way, they don't seem to add up. Even in the early years, the foundation of their story truly just depends on who's telling it. Before Prince George and before the disappearance, Ronnie and Doreen know each other as teenagers. They're friends for years before anything becomes romantic. On a bus ride home from school one afternoon, Ronnie asks Doreen to be his girlfriend, and she is thrilled. For a moment, it feels like your typical high school sweetheart's love story. Simple, hopeful, and uncomplicated. But that moment doesn't last, and their relationship is allegedly anything but. In 2017, during testimony at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, Marlene shares that Doreen is assaulted while attending Prince George College, a Catholic high school in 1979. The assault results in pregnancy, and Doreen's first son, Russell, is born on February 28, 1980. Both Mabel and Marlene agree that Ronnie and Doreen are together during this time, but neither woman publicly names the perpetrator. Mabel doesn't even reference the assault in her account at all. Marlene, on the other hand, says Doreen does name someone, but after naming him, she is brutally beaten. There is no clarification about who carries out that beating or who the person responsible for the assault is. The assault itself seems to recede into the background of the family's history, rarely spoken about. To make matters worse, Marlene also explains that their father doesn't want her and their other sister Laureen at home while Doreen is pregnant. Looking at the timeline, it appears most likely that Doreen moves in with Ronnie's family after Russell's birth. It's possible that decades later, certain details may have blurred. It's also possible that Mabel and Marlene are describing very different experiences within the same household. Either way, their history doesn't end there. According to Marlene, an incident had occurred at a rodeo ground near Burns Lake. She and Doreen are laughing, talking, having drinks, enjoying the night. Then, out of nowhere, Ronnie punches Marlene in the face so hard that she loses consciousness. When she wakes, she sees Ronnie beating Doreen, who is simply trying to protect herself. The attack ends when three brothers, Robert, Ken, and Jack Burt, step in and beat Ronnie into submission. Afterward, Marlene says Doreen laughs it off and downplays what happened. Although it's the first time Marlene sees Ronnie lash out like that, she doesn't believe it's the last. Ronnie and Doreen's second son Ryan is born on July 26, 1985, and a few years later, the family moves from South Bank to a rental home on Strathcona Avenue in Prince George. Some sources claim that Ronnie loses his sawmill job before the move, though no verified source ever confirms this. Even so, the loss of work would be a reasonable explanation for relocating. By 1989, Ronnie and Doreen are raising two young boys while carrying trauma, conflicting narratives, allegations of violence, and financial pressure. They are living in a small rental on Strathcona Avenue, and Ronnie is struggling to find steady employment, desperate for work. So, when a tall man in a red checkered shirt offers work at a logging camp, the opportunity lands differently, and Ronnie simply can't turn it down. And he doesn't. Because this doesn't just sound like a job, it sounds like a way forward, a turning point for their entire family. That is until they are reported missing. When Ronnie's father reports the family missing, the investigation begins with almost nothing. On record, police know only a few basic details. Ronnie told his parents that he has work, the job is south of Clucos Lake, and it's supposed to last anywhere from 8 to 14 days. Beyond that, the picture is thin. It's unclear whether investigators are even aware of the man who had approached Ronnie at the bar and offered the logging job to begin with. So early reporting indicates that police don't know how the family actually traveled to the logging site, whether they left with someone, whether they drove themselves, whether anyone else saw them arrive. But either way, Ronnie's parents insist something is very wrong. They tell the RCMP their children are not the type to cut off contact. Mabel states it plainly. They are just not the kind to disappear without calling. This is not normal behavior for them. Still, law enforcement appears unconvinced. Public statements suggest Ronnie may have found additional work and may have decided not to contact home. The possibility of a voluntary absence seems to carry more weight than urgency. Then, on September 7th, the Prince George Citizen runs a headline, "Family is safe." The article incorrectly refers to the Jacks as a Burns Lake family and reported that they were found safe and sound after contacting the RCMP and Ronnie's father. But here's the kicker. None of it is true. None of it is accurate. And even worse, this caused the RCMP to close the case. So whatever active investigation may have been underway slows dramatically because the RCMP believed the family was safe. The Prince George Archive's available records indicate a correction is not printed until November 25th. Even then, the original article states the family called the RCMP. The follow-up explains that a sighting turned out to be a false alarm. A confirmed phone call implies verification. A sighting implies uncertainty. Those aren't the same thing. So what we have is a missing family and an uncorroborated sighting and/or phone call that ultimately closed the case of the Jack family disappearance just 7 days after they were reported missing. Months pass with little substantial public awareness, despite an entire family vanishing from a relatively small town. But by February of 1990, 6 months later, Prince George Crime Stoppers assembles a $22,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of the Jack family. And while this does help with expanding media coverage, half a year has already passed. And we're talking about untargeted coverage that's not focusing on the Indigenous community territory. By early 1990, additional details finally surface. A physical description of the man who offered the logging job is released to the public. He's described as white, between 6 and 6.5 feet tall, hefty, and dressed like a lumber worker. He has a clear complexion and brownish red hair, side-parted and falling to the bottom of his ears. He wears a mustache and a beard approximately 1 to 2 inches in length. The description is based on police sketches, a limited report, a false headline, a correction months later, a reward announced half a year after the disappearance, and a suspect described as a man much larger than Ronnie who stands at about 5'6". If a physical altercation or violence of any kind had occurred, it's likely it wasn't evenly matched, which is an unsettling realization. But the deeper question still remains. Where exactly is the Jack family now? As 1990 moves forward, the Jack family's disappearance doesn't resolve or really even move along at all. And throughout the remainder of that year, their names continue appearing in newspapers across British Columbia. But the coverage repeats the same essential facts. No new information surfaces, no confirmed sightings, no arrests, no recovery. By 1991, if any newspapers or other articles are written, very little of that reporting remains accessible online, and the public trail ultimately begins to thin. Then, by 1992, something shifts again. The RCMP moved from emphasizing the difficulty of solving the case to implying that members of the Indigenous community may be withholding information. RCMP Sergeant Roberts speaks to the Lake District News and references information the community may have. The specifics of that information, however, are never published. This is where it becomes difficult not to question the direction things are taking. For weeks, there is uncertainty about whether the family is even truly missing. Then the public is told they're safe, only for that to be corrected months later. And now the conversation turns toward the possibility that the Indigenous community, presumably the Chislata Carrier Nation of which the Jack family were a part of, is withholding information. Here's the thing. When the early response was already slow and the public reporting so confused, it's hard not to wonder why the focus shifts away from the investigative clarity and toward implication. Like, what exactly did the RCMP know? What did they find out, and why aren't they sharing that information? It raises an uncomfortable possibility. After the early confusion, the delayed urgency, and the incorrect reporting that the family was found safe, the suggestion that the Indigenous community might be withholding information feels like a shift in focus. Was it frustration, miscommunication, an effort to redirect attention maybe? We don't know. And to be clear, that interpretation is completely speculative. The reasoning behind the RCMP's implication of the Indigenous community has never been fully explained, and that's the frustrating reality of it. So from 1992 until 1995, there appears to be no meaningful Canadian media coverage at all. Their disappearance still has not been solved, and everything simply goes completely quiet. That is until 6 years later in 1995, when Prince George citizen staff writer Marilyn Story publishes an article titled "Local Family Missing for 6 Years, Disappearance Still a Mystery." And here's where things get even more interesting. The piece introduces details that had not been previously reported. According to that reporting, 3 or 4 months before the family disappears, Ronnie tells his mother that he owes someone money and that on the night the family vanishes, a male relative is inside the Jack home and overhears the conversation between Ronnie and his mother Mabel. That relative then leaves sometime between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m. Here's the thing though, his identity has never been publicly revealed. So if he had relevant information, it doesn't help resolve the case or even really help move it along. It wouldn't be until January 28, 1996, nearly 7 years after the disappearance, for the first real lead to arrive. A phone tip is received. Reporting differs on whether the call goes directly to the Vanderhoof RCMP field office or to an after-hours police operator before being transferred, but what is consistent is this. The call lasts approximately 10 seconds. The message is short, simple, and chilling. The Jack family are buried at the south end of a ranch. The specific ranch name comes through muffled and distorted. Whatever the caller says is unclear, but it's clear enough to prompt immediate action. Police react quickly, issuing a province-wide appeal and asking the caller to phone again. In speaking with reporters, Constable George Strader says that some kind of tragedy has definitely befallen the family and that investigators have to think the worst. That statement doesn't appear publicly in newspapers until March. When it does, the focus of the investigation narrows in. Because if whoever made the call was telling the truth, well, then the search is no longer spread across open wilderness. It centers on a ranch. On March 12th, the Prince George citizen reports another update. Constable Strader and Constable Judy Wolfenden state they believe the tip is made in good faith. The call is traced to a residence in Stony Creek, a small community about 6.5 miles southwest of Vanderhoof. That same night, just 45 minutes after the tip, Vanderhoof police visit the home on account of a noise complaint. When police arrive, there were between 6 and 9 people gathered for a small party. Investigators do track down more than half of those attendees, and after interviewing them, police don't believe the caller is among those questioned. At the time of publication, officers are still attempting to locate the remaining partygoers. With that, there is still no breakthrough. Despite this tip being the first and only real lead in the family's disappearance, nothing comes of it, and the caller is never definitively identified. By the year 2000, speaking to the province, Constable Judy Wolfenden, later Judy Thomas, says she believes the caller said Gordy's Ranch. But there's a problem, because there are many, many, many Gordy's Ranches out there. According to Wolfenden, the RCMP is still taking this lead seriously. She states that people are put under hypnosis, psychics are consulted, excavations are conducted, and ultimately tells reporters, it's hard to rule out anything, she says. There's always the possibility it was an accident, but to me, somebody out there knows something. In the same reporting, another revelation surfaces. The man originally described 6 to 6.5 feet tall, hefty, and dressed like a lumber worker has been identified and cleared. The original description of this man is later described as unreliable based largely on, quote, sketchy information, end quote, from a cousin who stopped by the Jack home while Ronnie and Doreen were packing. Now, it's difficult to reconcile how a description later labeled unreliable could still lead police to identify a man who matched it and then clear him. If the information was truly that unreliable, how was it strong enough to narrow down a specific individual in the first place? And what on earth type of investigation was conducted to clear that person? Constable Thomas suggests the unknown male may have simply driven the family somewhere, and that's it. In fact, he may not have been involved at all. Now, if I'm consuming all of this information correctly, then it stands to reason that a large white male who was dressed like a lumberjack drove his truck to the Jack home, where they all left together in his vehicle. So if that's true, then riddle me this. It's 1:30 a.m. The distance to Klukul's Lake is roughly 40 miles. A round trip could be made before morning. So why didn't he simply return after giving the family a ride? Well, it also stands to reason that if harm or violence had occurred, it may not have happened near the lake at all. So what evidence definitively ruled him out? 7 years, a strange call, a distorted ranch name, a suspect identified and dismissed, and still, we are no closer to finding the Jack family. The man described as the lumberjack figure, tall, broad, dressed for camp work, has always been a steady presence in this case. During the 2017 inquiry hearings, his significance was reiterated once again. We know he was identified and cleared, but what has never been publicly provided is a detailed explanation outlining how he was cleared with certainty. That absence leaves room for two possibilities. Either police were unable to clearly justify why their primary suspect was released, or they believed he was responsible but lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute. The latter is the more charitable interpretation. Given the historical criticism of the RCMP handling of missing and murdered Indigenous cases, the former can't be dismissed either. What reporting does suggest, and what appears to be broadly accepted, is that the man described by two witnesses was the same man who drove away with the Jack family that night. If that's true, then clearing him requires one of two conclusions. Either he dropped them off safely somewhere along Highway 16, or he delivered them to the logging camp as promised. The first scenario is almost impossible to disprove, but then again, there's another detail that often gets overlooked: the daycare. You know, the supposed childcare facility that the logging camp offered for Ronnie and Doreen's two sons. Well, Doreen's relatives expressed confusion about the daycare from the very beginning, and there is no confirmed public documentation showing that logging camps in 1980s northern British Columbia commonly operated childcare facilities. If no such daycares existed, then the job offer contained a falsehood from the very beginning, which makes the decision to clear the man far more difficult to understand. On the flip side, if they did exist, investigators could have identified which camps were operating near Klukul's Lake at the time, confirmed which offered childcare, and determined whether the Jack family ever arrived. If a legitimate camp with childcare was identified and the family was dropped off there, the man offering employment would likely have known what happened afterward, and clearing him would still raise questions. If no such camp existed, then the job itself was fabricated. Either way, the daycare possibility doesn't allow much room to adequately clear the mystery lumberjack man. There is another possible explanation for how he was cleared, though. He may have been confirmed to be a legitimate logger. His camp may have been identified. He may have told investigators that the family asked to be let out before reaching the camp and that he never saw them again. And mind you, all of this unfolds against the backdrop of rural northern British Columbia in 1989. Vast stretches of isolated terrain, long distances between towns, limited infrastructure. Even if the RCMP had immediately deployed extensive resources along Highway 16, it may have already been too late. Whether the perpetrator's goal was kidnapping, murder, trafficking, or even a burglary gone wrong, the outcome may not have changed. The family was not expected to check in for at least 8 days. In practical terms, whoever the family was with would have had a significant window of time to carry out whatever they intended, with no one yet actively searching for them. Either way, investigators were always playing catch-up. From the beginning, the case lacked clarity. Critical details were missing, sustained investigative attention appeared limited, early skepticism, a false newspaper headline, delayed public awareness, years without meaningful resolution. A young couple with 2 small children, last seen leaving their home in the middle of the night with a stranger for a sudden logging job miles away. In most cases, a disappearance like that would dominate headlines. An entire family, gone, would lead the news cycles, fill newspapers, stay in public conversation. But the Jack family were members of the Chislata Carrier Nation, and the level of coverage and urgency simply did not reflect the gravity of what had happened. To make matters even worse, relatives later shared that they were told by the RCMP that if they went to the media, they would no longer receive any information about the investigation. Not that there was a whole lot of information to begin with, but regardless of the unanswered questions, one fact remained steady. The family left with a stranger in the middle of the night, and their last known direction was along Highway 16. Highway 16 cuts across northern British Columbia, a long, isolated corridor that would later become known as the Highway of Tears, a road that already carried its own history long before August of 1989. Highway 16 is part of Canada's national highway system. It's also known as the Yellowhead Highway. The route spans more than 1,800 miles, stretching from east to west. Along the way, it connects cities like Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Edmonton, crosses the Canadian Rockies at Yellowhead Pass, and continues west through Prince George. From Prince George to Prince Rupert, roughly 450 miles, the highway carries another name, the Highway of Tears. The name reflects the disproportionately high number of murders and disappearances of women, primarily Indigenous, along this route since 1969. Coined during a 1998 vigil for the victims, it carries the grief of families who have lost loved ones along this corridor. Since that time, an alarming number of people, most of them First Nations, have disappeared or been murdered along or near Highway 16. It is not the only place Indigenous people go missing in North America, but it has become one of the most documented and studied stretches of road in the country. Over time, patterns began to emerge. Poverty, Indigenous identity, repeated criticisms of RCMP response, including delayed investigations and assumptions about so-called high-risk lifestyles. Frustration within First Nations communities grew as cases remained unsolved. Media and law enforcement narratives often suggested that communities were not forthcoming, even when investigative effort appeared minimal. In 2005, the RCMP requested that British Columbia's Unsolved Homicide Unit review certain cases connected to Highway 16. The review was triggered after behavior science experts noticed similarities among several disappearances. Media speculation followed, with some raising the possibility of a serial offender operating along the route. 3 cases were initially examined. Ramona Wilson was 16 years old when she was last seen on June 11th at 9:45 p.m. She left Smithers to attend a dance in Hazelton, approximately 45 miles away. Her remains were discovered on April 9th, 1995, by teenage dirt bikers in a wooded area off Highway 16 near the Smithers Airport. A yellow rope and nylon cable were found near her body. Clothing was located nearby. Her shoes were never recovered. Roxanne Thiara had been placed in youth detention at 12 years old for a petty offense and struggled after her release. By 15, she was involved in drugs and sex work. She was last seen in Prince George and told a friend she was meeting a client. Her remains were later found in brush near Highway 16 before Burns Lake. Leah Germain left a Native Friendship Center Christmas party for street youth, saying she would return. But she did not. Her remains were found that same night behind a former elementary school near Highway 16, discovered by teenagers. When the 2005 review expanded, it became clear that the number was much larger. The RCMP acknowledged at least 18 similar cases. That figure has not been officially updated since 2007. Indigenous communities estimate the number is at least 40 and that it continues to grow. The inquiry ultimately concluded that investigations along the corridor had been wholly inadequate. The issue, however, extends beyond Canada. It's often referred to as MMIW, MMIWG, or MMIP, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, or more broadly, Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. The crisis occurs across Canada and the United States. Part of the challenge lies in jurisdiction. Responsibility can be divided among federal, provincial, or state and tribal governments, creating investigative gaps and delays. In the United States, according to the National Institute of Justice, Native American women experience higher rates of violence than the average American woman. They are approximately 20% more likely than a white woman to experience violence. 97% of Native victims experience interracial aggression and 35% experience interracial violence. A report released in early 2025 pointed out a stark gap. While the NCIC listed 5,491 Indigenous women as missing as of late 2024, only 261 of those cases appeared in the NOM-US database, another federal system, underscoring just how significant the underreporting is. If you've been following the podcast for a while, some of this may sound familiar, and that's because it is. I covered similar patterns in episode 15, The Murder of Sonia Ivanov in Nome, Alaska. The geography may differ, but the underlying reality remains the same. Native women face substantially higher rates of violence. Jurisdictional overlap created enforcement gaps, and Highway 16 exists within that broader reality. The Jack family disappeared along this same road. They fit the geography, they fit the timeline, they fit the reoccurring vulnerabilities that had already been documented. The road already had a history, and the system already had weaknesses. Their case unfolded inside both. When the RCMP compiled its Highway of Tears database, the Jack family wasn't included. By the time the Highway of Tears investigation formally began, they had already been missing for 15 years. Their absence from the database wasn't due to timing, but for another reason entirely. Most of the cases in that database involve a single victim. The Jack case involved an entire family, 4 people. And in some ways, that difference makes their absence from the official count even more striking. When we look back at how their disappearance unfolded, the gaps are hard to ignore. There was early skepticism about whether they were even truly missing. A false newspaper report declared the family safe. The investigation effectively stalled just 7 days in. Months passed before meaningful public awareness took hold. Years passed before serious leads emerged. A suspect was identified and cleared. The logging camp daycare claim was never definitively resolved. There were no bodies and no prosecution. When the inquiry into Highway of Tears cases later concluded that investigations along this corridor had been inadequate, the Jack family's case echoed that finding. Delayed urgency, limited follow-through, structural indifference. The most recent official search for the Jack family occurred in August of 2019. The RCMP used ground-penetrating radar on the Saikus First Nation property in a 3-day search that was ultimately unsuccessful. In 2020, 8 progression photos were released. In 2022, despite the absence of remains, the RCMP began treating the open missing persons case as a homicide investigation. As of 2025, Ronnie and Doreen's families continue searching on their own. They return year after year, refusing to give up, committed to finding the remains of Ronnie, Doreen, Ryan, and Russell. Again and again, the same vulnerabilities surface in cases like this: economic instability, Indigenous identity, and a system that hesitated before fully committing resources. A mystery that unfolded along a road already marked by tragedy and loss. And if the investigation failed the Jack family, it did so within a framework that had failed many before them and many after. If you have any information at all that could help authorities find Ronnie, Doreen, Ryan, and Russell Jack, please contact the Prince George RCMP at 250-561-3300. You can also contact Northern BC Crime Stoppers anonymously at 1-800-222-8477 or submit a tip online at northernbccrimestoppers.ca. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Darkly Speaking. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're listening, and I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.